Arctic Circle, midnight sun. The silence of the frozen wasteland shattered as engines roared across the ice. Russian tanks crawled over the tundra, escorted by nuclear-powered icebreakers and submarines cutting through black waters below. In the distance, oil rigs and military fortresses burned with spotlights, newly raised under Moscow's command. Across the ocean, satellites caught the movements. In Washington and Ottawa, alarms sounded. Russia had seized the roof of the world, the Arctic, rich in oil, gas, and shipping lanes. The United States and Canada now faced a choice: surrender the pole or fight for it. And so began Operation Arctic Fire, the first great war of the frozen North. Arctic Circle, midnight sun. The silence of the frozen wasteland shattered as engines roared across the ice. Russian tanks crawled over the tundra, escorted by nuclear-powered icebreakers and submarines cutting through black waters below. In the distance, oil rigs and military fortresses burned with spotlights, newly raised under Moscow's command. Across the ocean, satellites caught the movements. In Washington and Ottawa, alarms sounded. Russia had seized the roof of the world, the Arctic, rich in oil, gas, and shipping lanes. The United States and Canada now faced a choice: surrender the pole or fight for it. And so began Operation Arctic Fire, the first great war of the frozen North. The American response came before the Arctic sun could dip below the horizon. At 0400 GMT, engines roared across the Alaskan tundra. Squadrons of F-22 Raptors and B-2 Spirits streaked north, their flight paths concealed by the endless night sky. Over the ice, satellites relayed their every move, while submarines beneath the Arctic Ocean shifted silently into attack positions. The United States had decided Russia's claim to the North Pole would not stand. Canada joined instantly. From Yellowknife and Iqaluit, CF-18 Hornets thundered into the cold air, escorting American bombers. Arctic brigades mobilized, deploying snowmobiles, light armored vehicles, and drones designed for sub-zero operations. For the first time since World War II, Canadian forces prepared to fight not on distant battlefields, but on their own frozen frontier. The opening blow was aimed at Russia's newest base on Severnaya Zemlya. American B-2 bombers, invisible to radar, swept in low. Their bays opened, releasing precision-guided munitions. Explosions tore across the icebound runway, shattering hangars and fuel depots. Flames lit the polar night like false daylight. Within minutes, the forward base that Moscow had touted as untouchable lay in ruins. But Russia was ready to escalate. From Murmansk, two 160 Blackjack bombers launched volleys of KH-101 cruise missiles toward Greenland. Their targets, U.S. radar stations and the vital Thule Air Base. Interceptors scrambled from the base, engaging in supersonic duels above the ice. Several missiles were shot down, but others slammed into communications hubs, temporarily blinding NATO's early warning grid. At sea, the clash turned brutal. Russian Yasen-class submarines fired torpedoes into Arctic shipping lanes, forcing NATO convoys to scatter. American Virginia-class hunters retaliated, their sonar tracking the echoes of their adversaries. In one violent exchange, two subs collided beneath the ice, detonations shaking glaciers hundreds of miles away. The Arctic seabed became a graveyard of twisted steel. On the surface, nuclear-powered icebreakers escorted Russian mechanized columns across the frozen cap. Tanks fitted with Arctic treads lumbered over the ice, supported by mobile missile systems. Their objective was clear: push west toward Greenland and secure a bridgehead that would lock NATO out of the pole. But the Americans had anticipated this. From the skies above Canada, B-52 Stratofortresses dropped Moab-class bombs along the Russians' path. Massive craters shattered the ice sheet, flooding routes with seawater. Columns that had once moved steadily now struggled against collapsing terrain, vehicles plunging into freezing water. What had been an advance turned into a nightmare of survival. The Canadians struck next. Special Forces units parachuted deep into contested zones, planting explosives on Russian radar towers and sabotaging supply lines. Operating in white camouflage, they blended with the snow, striking swiftly before disappearing into the endless white. Each explosion echoed across the ice, another message that NATO was not yielding. Yet the most shocking escalation came from orbit. At 0920 GMT, a U.S. reconnaissance satellite blinked offline. Minutes later, Russian state television boasted that a new directed energy system had neutralized enemy assets. Analysts realized with horror what that meant. Russia had deployed lasers capable of blinding or destroying satellites. Within hours, American systems retaliated, targeting Russian military satellites with their own experimental weapons. The battle for the Arctic had expanded into space. The world watched in disbelief. News feeds showed footage of burning oil rigs, downed aircraft smoking on the ice, and mushrooming fireballs where bombs shattered glaciers. Environmentalists warned of a catastrophe: oil spills into pristine seas, radioactive leaks from destroyed bases. Politicians argued whether the war was about territory, energy, or survival. For the soldiers on the ground, none of it mattered. The Arctic had become hell on ice. By the second week of combat, NATO held the skies above Greenland and Alaska, but Russia clung to its fortresses near the pole. Neither side showed signs of retreat. Tanks roared across frozen plains, submarines stalked the depths, satellites blinked out in orbit. The escalation was total. The frozen north was no longer a frontier, it was the front line of World War III. The third month of the Arctic War began with a roar that shook the ice sheets. From Barrow, Alaska to Murmansk, Russia, the skies glowed with contrails and burning wreckage. The battle for the North Pole itself, once thought impossible, had arrived. Russian forces struck first. Armored columns, painted white to blend with the snow, surged northward over the drifting ice. Their tanks, modified with reinforced treads and heated engines, advanced behind the thunder of rocket artillery. Nuclear-powered icebreakers escorted them across fractured seas, smashing through floes to clear channels for supply ships. Overhead, squadrons of Su-57 stealth fighters carved contrails through the polar twilight. But NATO was waiting. From Thule Air Base in Greenland, American B-21 Raiders lifted into the sky, stealth wings cutting across the stratosphere. They carried payloads designed for one purpose: to erase Russia's Arctic fortresses. Canadian CF-18s escorted them, while American F-35s patrolled high above the ice cap, ready to clash with any Russian aircraft that challenged the approach. The first strike came at dawn. Precision bombs rained down on Russia's central stronghold near the pole. A sprawling complex of bunkers, oil rigs, and missile silos carved into the ice. Explosions tore open the base, igniting fuel reserves and fireballs that lit the frozen horizon. For a moment, it seemed NATO had shattered Moscow's dream of Arctic dominance. Then the counterattack began. From silos hidden beneath the polar shelf, Russia launched its hypersonic avant-garde missiles. They streaked across the atmosphere at unimaginable speed, diving toward Thule, Anchorage, and NATO fleets, patrolling the Barents Sea. Alarms screamed as interceptors fired in desperate arcs. Some missiles were destroyed, others slipped through. One NATO destroyer erupted into flame, its wreckage sinking beneath the polar waves. The sea battle reached its climax. U.S. carrier strike groups operating at the edge of the ice pack launched wave after wave of FA-18s and drones. Russian icebreakers, bristling with missile launchers, fired back with Onyx and Kaliber salvos. The Arctic Ocean boiled with explosions, burning hulks drifting between icebergs like tombstones. Submarines hunted beneath the carnage, torpedoes detonating with thunder that cracked the ice for miles. On the ice itself, the unthinkable happened. Tank battles at the top of the world. American M1A2 Abrams, retrofitted for Arctic combat, clashed with Russian T-14 Armadas across frozen plains. The roar of engines mixed with the crack of cannon fire as shells blasted through walls of ice. Entire ice ridges collapsed under the fury, swallowing vehicles into the freezing abyss. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in blizzards, their silhouettes barely visible through blowing snow and smoke. But the true climax unfolded above the earth. As the fleets clashed and tanks burned, the sky filled with silent beams. Both sides had unleashed directed energy weapons, aiming at satellites. Blinding flashes lit the upper atmosphere as orbital platforms went dark, tumbling uselessly through space. With every satellite destroyed, the battlefield below grew more chaotic. GPS jammed, communications scrambled, targeting systems failing. The Arctic War had cut the world off from its own technology. The final act of the culmination came when NATO special forces struck deep. Parachuting directly onto the ice cap, American and Canadian commandos assaulted Russia's command bunker near the pole. Explosions lit the frozen night as charges brought down antenna towers and radar domes. In brutal close-quarters combat, they seized hard drives, maps, and orders that revealed Russia's endgame: total control of the Arctic shipping lanes, backed by nuclear blackmail. But even as victory seemed within NATO's grasp, the cost was staggering. Entire fleets lay destroyed, thousands of soldiers lost to the ice, satellites burning up in the atmosphere. The Arctic was no longer pristine. It was a wasteland of oil fires, shattered icebergs, and the wreckage of two superpowers' ambitions. By the end of the third month, one truth was clear: neither side had achieved dominance. The Arctic had become a graveyard, and yet both Russia and the United States prepared for one final push. The culmination had passed. Resolution was coming. The Arctic sun hung low, bleeding red across a sky choked with smoke. Beneath it, the once pristine ice cap groaned under the weight of wreckage. Charred tanks half buried in snow, twisted steel from sunken ships rising through fractured ice, and oil fires burning endlessly on the frozen sea. The North Pole, once a symbol of untouched wilderness, had become the graveyard of superpowers. By the fourth month, both Russia and NATO were exhausted. Fleets lay shattered, air wings decimated, and entire divisions entombed in the permafrost. But the fight was not over. Each side still sought one last act to tilt history. Russia moved first. From bases in Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula, it launched a desperate final offensive. Waves of two 160 bombers, escorted by a Su-57 fighters, aiming to crush Thule Air Base in Greenland and sever NATO's lifeline to the pole. It was a gamble. Throw everything forward, cripple NATO logistics, and declare the Arctic theirs by right of occupation. But NATO was ready. American F-22s waiting high above the polar circle descended like hawks. A dogfight erupted in the thin, frigid air, contrails twisting into spirals of flame. Canadian Hornets joined the fray, streaking across the horizon, while B-21 Raiders slipped unseen past the chaos to strike Russian positions. Cruise missiles fell on Murmansk's naval docks, detonating submarines before they could leave port. The Russian gamble collapsed into fire. Meanwhile, on the ice itself, the war ground to its bloody finale. Russian armored brigades, low on fuel and surrounded by collapsing ice, attempted to hold their stronghold near the pole. But American and Canadian special forces, supported by NATO drones, encircled them. One by one, tanks fell silent, their crews surrendering in the white wasteland. By the final week, Russia's Arctic army was no more. Yet the cost of victory was devastating. Half of NATO's polar fleet was gone, and with it the fragile balance of naval dominance. Thousands of soldiers from both sides were missing, presumed frozen beneath the shifting ice. Entire constellations of satellites had been blinded or destroyed, leaving the world's communication grid fractured. And the environment, the Arctic Ocean itself, bled oil and radiation into waters that might never recover. In Brussels, NATO leaders met in grim silence. "We have won the battle," one general said, "but perhaps we have lost the pole forever." Canada, furious at the devastation on its doorstep, demanded permanent bases across the north. The United States promised to guard the Arctic for future generations. Europe hesitated, shaken by the sight of another frontier poisoned by war. Moscow faced humiliation. The Kremlin announced the withdrawal of expeditionary forces from the Arctic, framing it as a completed mission. But the truth was undeniable. Russia's bid to dominate the top of the world had ended in defeat, its fleets crippled, its prestige shattered. Citizens back home whispered the unthinkable, that the frozen north had been Russia's Afghanistan on ice. The world reacted with shock. Oil prices soared, global shipping rerouted, economies wavered. China and India moved swiftly to fill the power vacuum, increasing their presence in polar research stations, hinting that the Arctic might not belong to NATO or Russia alone. The battle may have ended, but the struggle for the pole was only beginning. And for the people who fought there, Americans, Canadians, Russians alike, the memories were carved in frost and blood. Soldiers recalled firefights in blizzards where they could barely see the man next to them. Pilots remembered dogfights above seas that looked more like mirrors than oceans. Submariners spoke of sonar pings echoing in the dark, knowing death might come in silence. The resolution of Operation Arctic Fire was paradoxical. NATO stood victorious, yet the Arctic lay ruined, its ice scarred by fire, its future uncertain. The world had glimpsed a new kind of war, one fought not in deserts or cities, but on ice, under auroras, and even in space. And the lesson burned like the flames still dancing across the ice sheets. The last frontier of Earth had become just another battlefield. The pole no longer belonged to nature, it belonged to war. Disclaimer: this video is a fictional simulation. It does not depict real events. It imagines how such a conflict could unfold and what consequences it might bring for the world.